This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We look now at how voters chose to expand the use of the election method known as ranked choice voting during Tuesday's midterm elections. Ranked choice voting was on the ballot in the entire state of Nevada and many cities. It also shaped the outcome of races where it's already in place. Supporters say it could reduce polarization in politics, give more voice to independent voters, among other things. In Nevada, the yes vote leads for a ballot measure that would change the state's elections to a system of a nonpartisan primary that allows voters to choose candidates from any party. After the primary, ranked choice general elections would let voters rank their top 5 candidates who advanced. Meanwhile, in Maine's largest city of Portland and in Evanston, Illinois, voters backed measures to use ranked choice voting in city elections. In Alaska, the state's ranked choice voting system will decide which candidate will represent the state in Congress after the Senate race remained undecided when none of the candidates received half the vote. Voters in Alaska approved the new system in 2020. The 2022 August special election was the first time they were used in the state. In that election, Democrat Mary Peltola beat former governor and 2008 Republican vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin to fill an open U.S. congressional seat. Peltola campaigned on reproductive rights and made history as the first Alaska native in Congress. For more, we're joined by George Cheung, director of More Equitable Democracy, who's been following all of this very closely. We welcome you to Democracy Now! George, you've said ranked choice voting is a necessary step in the unsexy but critical work of crash-proofing our democracy. Can you explain what you mean? Assume people haven't even heard of ranked choice voting, though it's happening all over the country.
Yes. First, I want to say thank you, Amy, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Currently, we in the United States use a system for our elections called winner-take-all with plurality rules, meaning that candidates, whoever has the most votes on election day wins that election, which means that a plurality could win and a majority could, in fact, vote for a different candidate. So ranked choice voting is both a ballot style and a tabulation method in which voters get to rank their choices, let's say 1 through 5, or potentially as many candidates as there are on the ballot. And then once you start telling them, you look at if someone receives a majority of votes, and if someone does, then the election's over. If there isn't, then usually the last place candidate gets eliminated, and those votes get retabulated or reallocated to those voters' second choices. And that process continues to repeat itself. And so in terms of the actual reform itself, the best version of ranked choice voting is when you don't actually have a primary, when you have lots of choices in the general election for voters to choose on with high turnout, and therefore you get the most voice for those voters.
Explain what happened in Alaska so people can really understand how this played out.
So in Alaska, which recently approved ranked choice voting, it's a top 4 system. So in the primary, you choose a candidate, and then based on the results of the primary, 4 candidates go to the general election. And so you had 3 fairly high-profile candidates with lots of name recognition, and voters would just rank their choices. There was a lot of enthusiasm for Mary Peltola, a native Alaskan, who ended up getting the most number of votes, but looks like she didn't get the majority. However, voters, because there's ranked choice voting in Alaska, were allowed to rank their choices, and since it seems like it may play out very similarly to the special election, the bottom vote getter will get eliminated, and those votes will get reallocated to other candidates. And because I believe that Representative Peltola, since she is currently in office now, campaigned in a way that really engaged voters deeply and said, if you don't want to vote for me for your first choice, vote for me for your second choice. So that's an also big benefit of ranked choice voting, because it forces candidates to really continue to engage all voters, as opposed to saying, well, if you're not going to vote for me, I'm just going to move on to the next voter.
Talk about Portland, Maine, and Evanston, Illinois.
So one really important thing to know is that there are different versions of ranked choice voting. And at the core, we really need to understand that we use a system called winner take all. This is a really old system that dates back into the 1400s. And so beginning in about the 1800s, there were movements towards big reforms as the franchise began to expand to people who didn't have wealth, to women, to people of color. And many countries and American cities ended up doing a lot of reforms in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so that really stopped by the time of World War II and the Red Scare, because a lot of people of color and progressives started to get elected. What's really exciting in Portland, Oregon, is the story of communities of color led by the Coalition of Communities of Color in Portland, Oregon. There was a lot of frustration about the city government because it was elected all at large, meaning that you had to run essentially a congressional race in order to win. And there was a really meaningful charter review process that was run by the city, where communities of color had a leadership role in educating themselves about the implications of electoral change, really engaged deeply to deliberate about what reforms they wanted to see, and actually came out with a recommendation. 17 out of the 20 commissioners agreed to put a form of ranked choice voting on the ballot, a form known as proportional representation. That went to the ballot, and on election night, the results showed that the charter reform was winning by about 10 points, 55 to 45. The form of the reform would essentially create 4 multi-member districts with ranked choice voting, meaning that each district, you only need 25% of the vote share to win one of those seats. This really will open doors for communities of color, for low-income people, for renters to be fully represented in that legislative body. And just in terms of historical context, this form of ranked choice voting hasn't been enacted since New York City did in the mid-1930s.
And talk about what happened in Seattle, Washington.
Seattle, Washington had ranked choice voting as well as approval voting on the ballot. This was being promoted by
and again, explain the difference between ranked choice voting and approval voting.
Oh, right. Ranked choice voting, as I've already explained. Approval voting is a different system in which you essentially get to give like a Facebook like or a thumbs up to candidates, as many candidates as you want. And so there was an interesting head-to-head. Approval voting supporters gathered enough signatures to put it on the ballot. And the city council, given that there wasn't a deep deliberative process that they had, let's say in Portland, decided that it was important for voters to have a choice and put ranked choice voting side by side with approval voting. So there were 2 questions. Shall there be change in terms of the system of elections? And if there is a change, which should be approval or ranked choice voting? The first question in terms of should there be a change is still on the bubble. It's about 50-50, and we won't know for a couple of weeks in terms of the outcome of that election. But in terms of the choice between approval voting, which many, including myself, believe that it is potentially could dilute the voting rights of communities of color versus ranked choice voting, which has shown to really allow for more voice for communities of color. Voters supported ranked choice voting by a margin of 3-1. So we're really excited that ranked choice voting, particularly proportional ranked choice voting, is really gaining steam in this country.
George Cheung, if you can talk about, well, you now have ranked choice voting in 2 state elections, right, in Alaska and Maine, and 10 cities. Who are the forces for ranked choice voting, and who is fighting against it?
I would say the forces for ranked choice voting are people who really care about democracy. We know that our democracy is really in danger. It's really fragile. And so people from all walks of life are really coming out of the woodwork to really think deeply about what's at stake and really starting to have conversations beginning at the local level about how we can really strengthen democracy so that we all have choices that really reflect who we are. Who's really opposed to it are, frankly, the powers that be. The current system of winner-take-all with plurality elections really favors particularly fringe elements on the right in particular, who have been able to really dominate the redistricting process to draw districts that really favor incumbents and their own party, and really are really nervous about any change. I think what's really important to know is that ranked choice voting and proportional representation doesn't favor any particular party, but essentially is a system that allows for a truer representation of who we are as a community.
Do you see any chance of a presidential election being ranked choice voting?
Well, I would say that I think about winner-take-all elections as an old car that your grandma gave to you when you're in high school. Sure, you can change the ignition and rotate the tires, but in the end, it's an old car, and ultimately you have to buy a new car or find another different way to work.
So you're comparing ranked choice voting to an electric car?
I would say that, you know, we have been using a system that has been in place since the 1400s with very, very little change. And so as we have become more of a multiracial society, we need to have rules that reflect that. And frankly speaking, winner-take-all elections with plurality rules are just at odds with achieving a multiracial democracy.
George Cheung, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of More Equitable Democracy. Next up, carbon billionaires. Stay with us.